So 2 maps for 1 writing prompt. And the first type of question that you'll see is a map of the past and a map of the present. So looking at 2 of the same things, but one in its past and one in the present. You'll also encounter scenarios where both maps are in the past, and you might also get maps which show proposals for the future. So something like a redevelopment scheme for a housing complex, or perhaps a golf course, for example. So these are the 3 most common scenarios. And with that, it's very important to use the proper tenses to describe the changes. So you might have to use present perfect versus past simple, for example. So past simple would be in the past. Present perfect would be for something that continues on from the past to present day. Or you might have to use the passive voice, because again, if we're talking about something like a redevelopment scheme, it's not very important who is doing the action, but what is going to happen or what has changed in the past. So before we even look at the outline and how to write this essay, let's familiarize ourselves with the grammar. So here I've got some great grammar tips. And these 6 phrases are quite useful. You're going to use them a lot when it comes to these types of questions, when looking at the present, looking at the past. So let's get started here. The first example says, over the 10-year period. So here we're looking at a period of 10 years. A way to end this sentence, we could say, the island has witnessed big changes. Now, this is applicable if the 10-year period comes into the present. Since we're still in the 10-year period, we would say the island has witnessed big changes. If your 10-year period is completely in the past and you've made this known in your essay, you would simply use the past tense. Here we're looking from 1990 to 2010. This is definitely in the past, so we would use the past simple. So we could say from 1990 to 2010, a new park was constructed where a school once stood. So that means this is finished, it's in the past. Remember, you want to use past simple for a finished action in the past. Now let's look here. In the period from 1990 onward, very important this word, onward, the city center has seen dramatic changes. So onward still continues into present day, which is why we would use present perfect. Here we see over the years. This is quite vague. So we would say a new shopping center has been built. This is not specific to a time, and over the years could contain today. So if we're talking about something, a map or a redevelopment scheme that is currently in existence, we could say this. In the last 20 years. So if we say in the last, that means it is continuing up to today. So we would use present perfect. In the last 20 years, the green spaces have been profoundly affected and were replaced by housing. So this is a mix. This is really great for your grammar, especially an advanced level of grammar. In the last 20 years, the green spaces have been profoundly affected. So this is continuing up until today, because let's say we're talking about 2000, so we're in 2020, it is still 2020, and so the green spaces have been affected since it's continuing up to today. However, before they were replaced by housing, it's quite specific, it's before they were affected, they were replaced by housing, so we would use past simple for this last section here. And lastly, we see in the years after 1990. Now this is specific because we know it is after a certain date. The island changed considerably. So even though we don't have the exact date, the exact year, we know it was sometime after 1990, which is specific enough, and that would lead us to use past simple. So basically what you have to remember is present perfect for something that started in the past and continues today, past simple for a finished action in the past. And you can also use present perfect if you just don't know when it happened. So for example, like we see here, over the years, we just don't know when, it isn't specific. So you could say a new shopping center has been built. Very important to review this for your grammar score. We'll talk about the scoring a little bit later, but make sure you are aware of the differences between past simple and present perfect. And also notice how these are in the passive voice. So we don't know, for example, who built this new shopping center. We don't know who constructed this new park. So you want to use the verb to be in the present perfect plus the past participle after when you're looking at present perfect passive. Sometimes you'll see past active as well. So the island changed considerably. That is the active voice. So you'll just have to see whether or not it's important to use passive or active. A great rule of thumb is if the object is more important than the subject, if you want to emphasize the object, definitely use the passive. So for example, if we look at this example here, a new park was constructed. That is the main idea. We don't really have to talk about the construction workers who constructed the park or the workers or the planners. While that could be important in another type of essay, in our essays for today, the main idea is going to be the object. So that is why the passive is mostly used when we talk about maps and diagrams. So again, keep this in mind, practice this, and you'll see how we can implement it today. One more thing, it's really helpful to describe locations when we look at maps. So I want you to keep this compass in mind with the directions. And let's look at north first. So these are some great ways to talk about the north. We could say to the north of something, or just north of, northeast of, which is very specific, or northwest, which would be here, and in the north. Then when it comes to south, it's very similar. So we've got to the south of, southeast, southwest, in the south, and also for the south, you could say on the south side of something. Then let's look at the east. So we have to the east of, or just east of, or just in the east. And same thing for its counterpart, the west. To the west of, or in the west. This is going to be very helpful when talking about locations or things on our maps. All right, so we are finished with the grammar for today, although I do want you to keep an eye out for the grammar we use. For now, I want to take you through a general guide that you can expect to use today for the essays. And we've got 2 steps. The first step is we're going to analyze the maps and describe key information from each map. Remember, we have 2 of these maps. And then quite simply, we are going to write an essay using the recommended essay structure for step 2. So just analyzing, planning a little bit, and then writing. This is the outline we're going to use. So we have an introduction, an overview paragraph, a body paragraph 1, and a body paragraph 2. Sticking to this foolproof outline is very helpful. I would suggest you do it. In our introduction, we are going to paraphrase the task question. Then in our overview paragraph, we're going to describe the major changes over time from the maps. And then in our body paragraph 1 and body paragraph 2, we're just going to describe the first map and then the second map in detail. So notice how our overview paragraph is not going to have specifics or details. That is going to be reserved for a general theme. The details will be left in the body paragraphs. All right, so keep this in mind. Now we're going to head on over and look at our first task question for today. So we see our 2 maps. First, I'm going to read the prompt, make sure that we understand it, and I will underline also some keywords. So it says, the diagrams below show the coastal village of Seaville in 1980 and 2010. Summarize the information by selecting and reporting the main features and make comparisons where relevant. Write at least 150 words. Okay, so we see our first map, 1980, and our second map, 2010. So obviously what we want to do first is really analyze this. Look at our notes on the right-hand side. So I've got the maps, map 1 and map 2. Remember, map 1 is going to be our body paragraph 1, and map 2, our body paragraph 2. Now, just from looking at this, it's quite obvious that it grew quite a bit from 1980 to 2010, and we'll have to show how it has grown. So I'm first going to focus on the differences and the key features from each map. So let's look at map 1 together. I'm going to make some notes here on the right-hand side. And basically, it looks like Seaville was quite tiny. We see a holiday cottage area and a hotel. So it seems like tourists were able to stay in this holiday area. I'll put holiday and hotel. And you see here, if you look at the East Bank, it's quite clear. The word that comes to mind here is that it's unspoiled. So you see that it's just an East Bank. If I look here, you see that there are some villages, there's some construction of a road, it seems. So the East Bank looks very clear. So I'm definitely going to note that. So East Bank, clear. I'll put unspoiled. It's a great word to use. Now, if I go back to the cottages, I see that to the east, so remember the cottages are here, the east would be to the right. It looks like there is a marsh. So I'm going to put to the right, we see a marsh. And then to the north, there is a woodland, and that is different from map 2. So I'm definitely going to note this. To the north, we see woodland. And then if we look here at the recreation that is available, the only thing we haven't talked about was this tea room and these sand dunes. So it looks like recreationally, there was only a tea room available for these tourists. And these are the main points. Now, if we look at 2010, we want to understand the key details, but also think about it in reference to 1980. So first off, it looks like the village had grown quite dramatically because we see all of these extra additions. So I'm going to say dramatic growth, okay? And it looks like there is a retirement village here. So I'm going to say that the retirement village looks like it is to the west of this main road, because this main road, like we said earlier, is also something new to the East Bank. As we see here, there was just a river. So now we have this main road. So I'm going to say there is a retirement village to the west of the main road. And then notice how we don't have a marsh in 2010. So it looks like the marsh has been drained. Okay, I think that's a good verb to describe a marsh, a wet area. It's been drained, and we no longer see these holiday cottages. Instead, we see a hotel, and we see the holiday cottages are right here by the East Bank to the east. So the marsh was drained, and we see that that has made way for permanent houses. So I'm going to say here, permanent houses. And then we see that the holiday cottages and also the hotel here have been constructed on the East Bank. So I'll say East Bank, and I'll talk about the hotels and holiday cottages. If we also keep looking at these areas and these changes, we see that the woodland area, which was to the north of the holiday cottages, has been replaced by a golf course. So I'm going to also make a note of that and say woodlands, and we'll say it's been replaced by a golf course. And another change that I see that I just want to talk about is this boat club here, which is on the west bank of the river. So if we see the river here, the East Bank is right here, so we could say the West Bank is obviously to the west. So I'll say here a boat club built on the West Bank. And the other change is this infrastructure. So if we see here, we have this rotary and this road. So I do want to talk about the infrastructure to access the East Bank, because that is also something that is key and different in 2010. The only thing that I do want to point out that hasn't changed Obviously, the C has not changed, but I do want to talk about this hotel. So you see we have this hotel right under the permanent houses. So to the south of the permanent houses, it has remained the hotel. So I do want to say that the original hotel remains. Now, this is a lot of information, but we're going to write it clearly. This is technically an optional step, but I would highly recommend that you write out these notes because it will help you see your essay before you even write it. Of course, you don't have to write full sentences. You can do exactly as I did, just using abbreviations and arrows, things that will help you. Now, since we are in the past, it's 2010, so that's definitely in the past, we are going to use past perfect here because we're going to talk about things that changed in the past from 1980 to 2010. So keep that in mind as I'm writing. And remember, all we really did here was just describe the key details, but as we're describing the key details, we're still looking at the changes that have been made. This is the main thing with this essay. You don't want to just describe and describe. You want to pay attention to what they say here by making comparisons where relevant. So it is important and it is relevant to talk about these houses, for example, or talk about the remaining hotel. This is what the examiner will look for, so make sure you are using this to your advantage. This is a common pitfall for most students. They will just talk about the first map and the second without really drawing any connections. So I'll teach you how to do that when we're writing. First thing first, though, we do have to talk about the overall trend. Remember, this is going to be our second paragraph after our introduction, and this is quite simple. In general, you see that there is a lot of development. So it developed substantially, I want to say, because you see that it grew quite a lot, and it started out as just a holiday town because we saw the holiday cottages and the hotel. Now in 2010, you see the permanent housing as well. So it looks like it grew from a holiday town to a permanent town over 30 years because we're looking again at 1980 to 2010. And I do want to talk about how the infrastructure and also amenities increased because we looked at this road here, we see a boat club, we see a restaurant, so all of these great things have increased. Okay, so we are done with our preparation work. Now, before we start writing, I just want to remind you about the scoring. We have to keep this in mind as we write our essays today. So let's just talk about the scoring quite briefly, and then we'll come back and write this essay. Okay, so for our scoring, there are 4 areas that we'll have to keep in mind. The first one is task achievement. So this is basically looking at whether or not we answered the question. So this is why it's very important to make those comparisons where relevant, like I just talked about. We want to make sure we're writing a minimum of 150 words and that we are describing each map, making comparisons, and just answering that question. Secondly, our coherence and cohesion is going to be looking at the logical flow of our essay. This is why using an outline is so important. You want to start off with a clear introduction, look at the overall trend, and then go into detail. If you mess that up, if you do it in a different way, it may not seem as logical to the examiner and you may lose points because your essay just won't seem to move logically. Now, the third and the fourth areas, this is what we talked about earlier in this video, and this will rely a lot on your prep work. So we have the lexical resource. This is the wording, the words that we choose, the vocabulary we use. Is it relevant? Are we using synonyms? Are we using really good connectors to talk about contrasting ideas, for example? And then the grammatical range and accuracy is very important, especially when it comes to these types of essays. We have to keep in mind our passives, our present perfect, and in our case, for the first essay, the past perfect, which I'll talk about in just a minute. So the more we're able to show a really complex range and use complex structures, the better our score will be, of course, if they are accurate. So keep all these 4 things in mind. Let's go back and write our first essay. Now you'll see that I've added here our outline. Of course, you don't want to do this on the actual exam. I'm just doing this here so that we are aware of the different sections and that you can follow along. So first, I'm going to obviously start with the introduction. And remember, this is a paraphrased sentence or two about our writing prompt. So I'm going to say here, the maps illustrate significant changes in the seaside town of Seaville over a 30-year period from 1980 to 2010. And that is really sufficient. So instead of saying the diagrams below, I have said the maps illustrate, instead of show, I said illustrate significant changes, because we do see quite a bit of changes in the seaside town. Now, seaside town is a synonym of coastal village. I have still included its name, Seaville, over a 30-year period, and make sure that you notice 30-year is an adjective. It describes the type of period. So I've got this hyphen, and then I've said from 1980 to 2010. So note that it is saying what we saw in our prompt, but it's saying so in a different way, and it's showing the examiner that I have a great hold on synonyms. So that is our simple introduction. That's really all we need. Let's go ahead to our overview and use our notes here for this overall trend. So I'm going to say, overall, the village developed substantially, because we looked at all of these changes, it is quite substantial, from a holiday settlement to a permanent town over the 30-year period. Similarly, infrastructure and amenities increased along with the town's capacity to provide for tourists. Now, I'll go through all of the vocabulary words and the synonyms I use, but basically just know that I used these notes here, 2 sentences, to talk about an overall trend. Note that I haven't really talked about specifics. I did mention the infrastructure and amenities, but that is general. So I didn't talk about the hotel, I didn't talk about the permanent housing, I just gave a general trend. So that's what we need for our overview. Let's go ahead and delve into body paragraph 1 using our notes right here. So I'm going to start off by saying, in 1980, Seaville was tiny, attracting only a few tourists, and this we saw from just the holiday cottages and just one hotel. And we'll say who were accommodated in cottages or a small hotel, exactly like we see in the map. Then I want to say something contrasting this. So in contrast, the East Bank was unspoiled. So even though there were some holiday cottages here, remember, we saw the East Bank was clear. Now I want to talk about some direction. So I want to say, to the east of the cottages was a marsh, and there was woodland to the north. So you see how I've talked about the east and the north. That's great to get some directions in there. Now I want to say, regarding recreation, besides the beach, the town only offered a tea room. And that is really all we saw in terms of recreation. And this includes all of the details we wanted to add from the first map. So I can go ahead and scroll down a bit so we can look at body paragraph 2, our last paragraph. And remember, we do have a little bit more to write in terms of all these details. Let's start writing. I'm going to say, however, because this is a contrasting theme here, the village had grown dramatically by 2010. So remember, I am talking about something in the past, so I'll need the past perfect. We'll talk about this later. Retirement villages had been built to the west of the main road, just like we saw here. The retirement villages are to the west. The marsh had been drained and the cottages demolished in order to construct houses. So remember, we saw this here, these permanent houses. I talked about that. Now I'm going to say, to cater for tourists, both a new high-rise hotel and holiday cottages on East Bank had been constructed. And you'll see that I sort of embellished on the type of hotel, and that is fine. You want to make sure that you're adding in your vocabulary and showing the examiner that you have a wide range of vocabulary. Now I'm going to continue. The woodlands had been cleared and supplanted by a golf course. And this is what we talked about here. The woodlands are gone. So I've said they've been supplanted, which is basically replaced by a golf course. Now I'm going to say, similarly, a boat club had been built on the west bank of the river, and new infrastructure was created to access East Bank. And now just to close, we are going to talk about the original hotel, and this is something that is different from all of these changes. So I'm going to say, on the other hand, the town had preserved the original hotel. And that is our essay. So now I'm going to clean it up a little bit just so that we can look at the wording and the grammar. All right, and here is a cleaned up version of our essay. I have our word count at 203 words, which is perfect. We've definitely fulfilled that minimum and not gone too far overboard. Now in blue, you will see synonyms and topic vocabulary. So this is basically anything that I found from the maps, as well as things like holiday settlement, which we see here, infrastructure, amenities. These are things that were not included on the maps, but should be known based on your previous research and vocabulary and things that you've learned when it comes to neighborhoods or holidays. Then I also have unspoilt. This was great just to say like untouched in the East Bank here because we didn't see any sort of construction there. And just remember, for your introduction, you want to use your synonyms. Now let's go to the red, important functional words. These are things that really tie the paragraphs together. They show contrasting arguments, they pull things, and they connect things. This is very important for your coherence and cohesion, as well as your lexical resource. So we see overall, similarly, in contrast, regarding when we want to be very specific. However, when you want to show a contrasting idea, similarly again, and then on the other hand, which is also used to show a contrasting idea. Now I've saved the best for last, the green, our useful vocabulary and phrases. Notice how basically everything is in the passive voice. So we see the village developed substantially. Here it is the past tense because we're looking at a 30-year period in the past. So keep that in mind. In our paragraph, body paragraph 1, we have our direction to the east of and also to the north. And then this last paragraph is very important, especially for their grammatical range and accuracy. You see how everything is the past perfect passive. So the village had grown dramatically by 2010. Remember, we're talking about something in the past. So it had grown dramatically to the west again, and we see the marsh had been drained. Remember, we don't know who drained it. It is not important. What is important is that the marsh had been drained. Supplanted is an excellent word, basically to say that something was replaced. But again, it's an advanced level vocabulary, very important to include it. And then we see here a boat club had been built. So I've just highlighted some examples of this passive voice, also with the past perfect, quite difficult. So just make sure you are prepared for this because you never know what type of map or what type of date you're going to see in the exam. All right, good job here. Now we're going to look at a different example. We're going to take things a bit quicker and see how our dates and our grammar will change in this next example. Okay, now we are going to look into the future. So let's go ahead and read our prompt. It says, the maps below show the center of a small town called Islip as it is now and plans for its development. Summarize the information by selecting and reporting the main features and make comparisons where relevant. Write at least 150 words. Now, this is, again, very similar to our last example, but using a different form of grammar. So we're looking into the future now. So we see how Islip is now and the planned development for the future. We also have a very helpful compass. This is something that will also encourage us to use directions. So let's go ahead and make some notes. Let's make a note about map 1. And if you look at map 1, especially in comparison to map 2, it is quite small, this Islip town center. So I'm going to first start out and say, of course, that it is quite small. We see there is a main road, and the main road goes from the west to the east. I'm going from left to right with shops on both sides. So I'll say it goes from west to east, shops on both sides. We see that the northern area is countryside. Okay, so again, using the north, we see that's countryside. And the southern area looks to be filled with housing. We also see a school. And what I see here is basically a fork. If you're coming from this road here, you see that there are two options. So we see an option to continue on and an option to head south. So that is the fork. At the end of the fork, we see a school. So I'm going to say end of fork. We see here a school. And that would be in the southwest corner. And then we see a park in the southeast corner right here. Remember, I'm using southeast and southwest. Now, that is really everything we need to say about the town center now. Again, it is small. We've got the housing, the countryside, the school, and the park. And of course, we've got our shops. Now, if we look at map 2, the biggest change seems to be this ring road. And a ring road is something that is circular, like we see it goes around the area. This is just something that you should pull out from your past vocabulary knowledge. There is this ring road. You can also say, again, like we see here, it's a dual carriageway. So it looks like it's going two-way, sort of like a two-way ring road. So I want to say that there is an expectation, it's expected to reform into a dual carriageway, okay? And that is going to contain all of the buildings, it seems. You see how everything is in this dual carriageway. So the shops that were along the north side of the new pedestrian street, if we look here, these shops that we saw in our first map, it looks like these are going to be demolished, for example, to make way for this bus station and the shopping center and the car park. So I want to say that these things will be demolished to make way for, I'm not going to write all of these things, I'm just going to know the bus station, the car park, etc. And then I'm going to make another point. It looks like the shops along the south side of the main road are actually going to remain. So shops along the south side, these are going to remain, but if you look here, it looks like the park is going to be reduced in size. So I'm going to say park reduced, and it also looks like more houses are going to be implemented because it says new housing right here. In our first map, it just says housing. So I'm going to also make a note about new housing. And then before we actually write the essay, I just want to talk about the overall trend. The biggest thing here, the general change you want to look at, is going to be this dual carriageway, or we could also say a ring road. That is the main change. So I'm going to say construction of a ring road around the center, and also developments with housing are also going to be the main area of change. So now that we've done our prep work, we've made our notes, quite simply, I'm going to show you the finished essay so that we can read it together and examine it for its grammar and vocabulary. All right, and here we are with our finished essay. Again, I've got the color coding for us. We have 198 words, which is great. We've definitely fulfilled that minimum and we haven't added too much. So let's read this together and then I will stop and go over the synonyms and the vocabulary and the functional words. It says, the diagrams illustrate some proposed changes to the central area of the town of Islip. Again, instead of maps, I've said diagrams. Instead of show, I've said illustrate. plans for its development. I've basically said proposed changes to, and the central area is a great synonym for the center of a small town. So you see, I'm still saying the same thing. It's really helpful if you have synonyms that you can use. So when you see maps, don't be afraid to use diagrams and vice versa. Okay, our overview paragraph, it says, overall, the principal change to the town will be the construction of a ring road around the center. Various other developments with regard to shops and housing will accompany the building of this road. And I've said overall, which is a great way to introduce the general idea. With regard to is a great way to be specific. So I'm specific about shops and housing. Principal change is basically the biggest change, but it's a nice way to say it in an advanced manner. Also, we have developments and accompany, so that means it's going to happen at the same time. It's going to join this other development. Now for our map 1, our body paragraph 1. As the first map reveals, the current Islip town center is relatively small. There is a main road from the west to the east with shops on both sides. The northern area contains the countryside, while the southern area is filled with houses, a school at the end of the fork road in the southwest corner, and a park in the southeast area. And that is exactly what we said in our notes. Again, I've just highlighted the directions in green. Fork road is very helpful to know from maps. And the countryside, which is just something I added up here. And as the first map reveals, is a nice opening phrase. Now our body paragraph 2, it says, in the future, the main road is expected to reform into a round, dual carriageway containing all of the new buildings. The shops along the north side of the new pedestrian street will be demolished to make way for a bus station, shopping center, car parks, and a new housing area. The shops along the south side of the street will remain, but it seems that the town's park will be reduced in size so that more new houses can be built within the ring road. In the future makes it clear that I'm talking about this second map. And then we have the directions along the north side, the south side of the street. And then our synonyms and topic vocabulary. Main road, reform is a great way to show a change. It will be demolished. To make way for is a great phrase. Basically, you're showing that the bus station is going to replace the pedestrian street. And of course, ring road or dual carriageway, these synonyms are great. Now again, I want you to just note the future passive here. So will be demolished is going to be the future passive. Again, we don't know who's going to demolish it. It doesn't matter. The main thing is that it's going to be demolished, or in this case, it will be demolished. Then we see the shops will remain, but the town's park will be reduced. So notice that will remain is active and will be reduced is passive, again, because we've got that lovely verb to be. And then can be built is another modal passive. So can is a modal. And so we've got this modal passive, houses can be built. Notice how we had 2 very different essays today. One used the past perfect passive, one used the future passive. Whichever one is more difficult for you is the one you should be practicing a bit more. You want to make sure that you are equally prepared for really anything, because we cannot know which essay we're going to get on the IELTS exam. So like we talked about earlier, practice your present perfect, your past simple, your future perfect if you need to. Just make sure you've got a strong hold on your grammar so that you can approach test day confidently. All right, great job. Let's go ahead and wrap up this lesson. So I'm just going to leave you with some do's and don'ts. For your do's, make sure that you analyze your maps before you start writing. It really helps to take some notes. This will help you understand the relevant points in each of your maps and also the comparisons. So making that short little outline or a table will really help you plan how to describe the information. I would highly suggest you do it. Today I spent some time on it and I went through it slowly, but with time and practice, you should be able to do that in just a minute or 2. Then, very importantly, you want to make sure you're implementing proper grammar. Remember the past, the future, basically just what I told you in the previous slide. Make sure you are confident with your grammar. And then, of course, organize your essay with that foolproof outline, your introduction, paraphrase test question, your overview talking about the overall trend, and then your 2 body paragraphs. Things you don't want to do not start writing the essay immediately. You do want to make some notes and you do want to write perhaps on your prompt, but do not just dive into your essay. Remember, it's going to be counterproductive. Of course, don't write the wrong amount. It might be a little bit easy to get carried away with this sort of question type because you have a lot to write, a lot of details about your maps, but you want to meet your minimum of 150 words and do not go too far above that. Stick to what we had today. That means you are getting your minimum in and you're elaborating when necessary. And of course, this goes without saying, you don't want to use incorrect grammar. You see how the active voice is hardly ever used in these types of essays. So really brush up on your passives. That is what examiners will look for. Again, great job. There was a lot of grammar in this video, but I hope